Welcome. I'm Tita Chico, Professor of English and Faculty Director of the Center for Literary and Comparative Studies at the University of Maryland. The center convenes this year-long series on anti-racism to act on statements of solidarity for Black Lives Matter, issued by the department, by the college, and by the university. Black Lives Matter. With this series, we also celebrate the memory of Second Lieutenant Richard Collins III, a young man who was about to graduate from Bowie State University in the spring of 2017, when he was murdered by a white supremacist on the campus of the University of Maryland, at a bus stop, waiting with friends. A young man whose parents successfully lobbied the state of Maryland to amend the hate crime laws. Second Lieutenant Richard Collins III. Black Lives Matter. And we convened this anti-racism series to honor and to highlight the long-standing commitment among many English department faculty and students to anti-racist scholarship and teaching. We also want to acknowledge that the grounds of the university are the original homelands of the Anacostan and Piscataway tribal nations, and that the university is dotted with buildings that at once name and erase this Indigenous history. Anti-racism is a practice that pushes us beyond the inadequacy of diversity and inclusion. As my colleague, Professor Zita C. Nunez writes, this is not the time, if ever there was a time, for shifting over a bit to make room, for being the one to allow others to speak, for making promises. This is the time for remaking, for asking who we are. And to be clear, anti-racism is also an intellectual principle. It is not an add-on in this series. It is the starting point for humanistic literary inquiry. Today, we have the great privilege of welcoming Dr. Josie Gill and Dr. Michell Chresfield for their conversation, Race in Science and the Humanities. Just a few miles south of our institutional home, Dr. Alondra Nelson, a social scientist trained in American studies, a scholar of science, technology, and social inequity, is the newly appointed Deputy Science Policy Chief for the US federal government. In this moment and on this stage, Dr. Nelson tells us that COVID-19 has held up a mirror to our society. She said, never before in living memory have the connections between our scientific world and our social world been quite so stark as they are today. And she says that as a Black woman researcher, I am keenly aware of who is missing from these rooms. So what, we want to ask, in the words of Dr. Gill, would it mean for us to examine the institutional structures and orders of knowledge that we reproduce in our work, and to understand how this connects us to the humans for whom we feel pity, but might keep separate from our intellectual thought? And that's a piece of hers. The link is in the chat. The Center's Anti-Racism series is co-sponsored by the University Libraries, the Graduate School's Office of Diversity and Inclusion, and the Petrie Foundation. With this support, we're able to commit to making these events accessible with live captioning. You'll find a link to the Typewell window in the chat. I want to thank Danielle Griffin and Liam Daly, the Center's graduate assistants, and a special thanks, as always, to Dr. Karen Nelson, co-director of the Center and director of research. Our speakers will be in conversation for half an hour, after which my colleague, Professor Christina Walter, will moderate the Q&A. Would you please join me in welcoming Dr. Gill and Dr. Chresfield for Race in Science and the Humanities? Thank you. And Josie and Michelle, if you could unmute yourselves and start talking. Thank you.
Awesome. Yes, thank you, Tita, for having both of us here. I'm really excited, Josie, to talk to you about your book and all things related to your research. So thank you all for who are attending and joining us. It is about 5 p.m. here in the UK. And the beautiful thing about technology, it allows us to connect and be in the same intellectual space, if not the same physical space. What I thought that we do is because our work is overlapping, but also kind of following different intellectual pursuits, we thought it'd be best to kind of take Josie first and talk more about her work, and then kind of switch, and then I'll be in the hot seat. So Josie, are you ready?
Yeah, I'm ready.
Awesome. Wonderful. So I had the good fortune of reading your book over the holiday break, and I, between Bridgerton and your book, it gave me really good, uh, a good time to spend. But I have so many questions. But I think, really going from Tita's really beautiful opening and thinking about Dr. Alondra Nelson, and then relating that to your work, how do you approach working on race and science at a moment when racism and scientific racism specifically seems to be making a return? And I'm thinking here about, white supremacist movements that might be thinking about kind of like biological difference in order to buttress themselves.
Thank you so much for that question, Michelle, and thank you to Tita Chico and to Karen Nelson, Christina Walter, and to Liam Daly and all the graduate students who've been involved in organising this seminar series. I'm really grateful for the work that you're doing. I just also wanted to say that I'm coming to you from Bristol, where many of you will know the statue of Edward Colston was torn down last summer, and just this week 4 people have actually gone on trial for that act. And I'm also at an institution which is trying to grapple with the legacies of the slave trade with which our whole city is completely bound up. So I just wanted to acknowledge that before speaking. But yeah, so the question of how to as a literary scholar or as a humanities scholar, approach race and science in this period where, unfortunately, certain ideas do seem to be returning, as you were saying, Michelle. There are white supremacist movements who are increasingly discussing genetics, genetic studies, apparently on their forums or, wherever it is on the internet that they talk to each other. And I think the New York Times reported a while ago that white supremacists were chugging milk because they had read this study that they thought they interpreted as white people were more evolutionary able to digest milk than other people, and they were sort of celebrating this. So there's all kinds of weird and wonderful, not wonderful, just weird ways in which certain kind of biological ideas of race are returning. And I think Trump, as he was trying to get re-elected late last year, was kind of apparently going around saying that he had good genes and saying to the crowds of people he was speaking to, "You've all got good genes, I've got good genes." And he said, he's got German blood and all of this sort of stuff. So you have those very kind of seemingly casual, but very prominent kind of ideas about genetics entering public discourse. And then obviously also in relation to COVID, just this week, the Home Secretary in the UK, Priti Patel, was trying to explain the differential impact of COVID on Black and Asian communities in the UK, and was basically implying that, they're just somehow more susceptible, that there's this seemingly biological difference. So I think there's a question about whether all of this actually represents a return or whether this has all been there all along. But no doubt we're in a kind of a political moment where these kinds of discourses are gaining some traction, and there's this return to a kind of biological understanding of race. So I think approaching that situation as a literary scholar can be quite tricky, because we are in a moment where this kind of post-truth moment, the attack on science, the attack on scientific expertise. So I think that humanities scholars, literary scholars, can be under some maybe pressure that we put on ourselves, or wider pressure, not to really pick away or do anything that might undermine science, particularly the scientific idea about race, which came out, which was confirmed by the Human Genome Project, that race isn't biological, that race has no genetic meaning, and that we need to leave that alone now, and that, you know, there's more genetic difference within so-called races than there is between them. So, you know, that is the established and the predominant scientific idea. And I think in the main, when you look at literary approaches to race that are dealing with science, they do generally tend to just take that argument on board and use that scientific idea. And that I think literary scholars are very much influenced by critical race scholars more widely in this regard. So you have people like Kwame Anthony Appiah, Henry Louis Gates Jr., and even Paul Gilroy, who have brought genetic science into their work to support their own kind of pre-existing understandings of race as a social construct and not as a scientific reality. And so you might think, well, what's wrong with that? You know, that seems fair enough. And indeed, I'm not disputing that finding, and I don't think there is. You know, I'm not saying that it's wrong, but what I find interesting in that kind of usage of science is that it marks a departure from the way that those very same scholars talk about science in the past. So when those scholars talk about the construction of race itself as a concept across the 18th and 19th centuries, when most scholars talk about it, it's kind of acknowledged that it was created. It was an interdisciplinary idea. So you had science, you had philosophy, you had literary, you had all kinds of discourses feeding into race. And science was you know, it was seen as the scientific ideas about race were seen as a product of the time, of the colonial context, of the imperial context. And so there's an understanding that science was very much influenced by all of these other things that were going on at the time. But obviously, when you then turn to 21st century science, which is saying something that maybe we as humanities scholars want to or do agree with, there's a tendency to then revert to a different understanding of science as this kind of objective, neutral, truthful, saying these things about race that are no longer complicated in the way they were historically. So I guess for me approaching this topic, I was kind of interested in that, interested in how I could approach contemporary science almost historically, but by looking at the kind of political, social, and cultural contexts which have made certain ideas about race possible in the 21st century. And I'm kind of following an STS scholar called Jenny Reardon in doing this, but I'm trying to expand her analysis to include the literary and the cultural, and really thinking about how that plays into the way that certain ideas about race emerge narratively. So I'm not trying to undo the finding that race isn't genetic, or that it's you know, the idea that race isn't biologic, that race is not, it's not a genetic. I'm not trying to say that that's not true. I'm just trying to understand what the conditions are that enabled that idea to gain such traction. And actually, I don't think it's a coincidence that that idea came about at the same time where we had this kind of post-racial discourse in the first decade of the 21st century, which kind of almost seems ridiculous now to think back to it, but there really was, you know, with Obama and everything, there was this belief that we were entering a post-racial period where racism was no longer really an issue, where, you know, Black people had gained, or people of color had gained a certain level of equality, and then we were kind of moving beyond race. And that, I think the science of race at that point was really feeding into and drawing upon that wider political climate. So yeah, I hope that sort of was quite a long way to answer the question, but I hope that's sort of getting into it.
Yeah, no, that was really, really great and giving me a lot to think about. So you touched on it towards the end of your discussion, but I'm really interested in the ways in which what you think, literary studies, I guess I should say, what race, the studies of race, have to learn from literary studies, and what I think one of the great things that your book does is think about what the literary has to contribute to studies of science. And so, would you be able to speak to that a little bit more?
Yeah, so I think through having done research in this area, I'm not kind of saying that there is one particular relationship that literature has to science, and actually, there is so much diversity in scientific perspectives on race in the 21st century that wouldn't be possible anyway. But I think if I could, I think there are probably two main ways in which I think the literary kind of speaks back to some of the absences in genetic discourse. And the first is that literature, the novels that I look at in my monograph, they nearly all make connections with history, with racial science past, and try to position the developments that are happening now within the context of what's gone before. And I think that works exactly against what scientific discourse does, which is very often creating this deliberate separation between eugenics, racial science of the past, and saying, but genetic science, we're anti-racist, we're completely different, we've moved on. And I think literature's one of those places where it helps us to see how those kind of older racial ideas continue to seep through into the present. But related to that, the other thing that I think literature does is draw attention to the ways that we actually can't easily separate the scientific from the social or the cultural, or indeed the imaginary and the fictional, in the way that we might feel that we want to. And again, this is something that genetic discourses on race do over and over again. They kind of say, right, well, we've said that race isn't biological, it's not real, so race is a social problem, and it's got nothing to do with us anymore. And there's this kind of continual very simplistic separation of the social from the scientific. And I think the novels that I look at in the monograph kind of demonstrate that it isn't really possible to do that, and they're very alive to the ways in which the fictional and the made up comes to be incorporated into science. So how the imaginary kind of shapes and impacts on the development and expression and transmission of scientific ideas and the public understanding of science, which is all part of science, and how genetic science functions narratively, rather than sort of neutrally or objectively within the racialized context that it's embedded in. So yes, to say these things might be to kind of potentially, endanger the scientific finding, or to align oneself with people who want to undermine science, but that's really not what I'm trying to do. And I think it's necessary that we do this work, because very often racial configurations emerge at moments when we appear to move beyond race, and when science appears to move us beyond race. And I think literature's very good at, as I said, showing how older racial thinking is often latent in the new, and the way that I think to sort of deny that would be as regressive as the attack on science itself. So I can talk. I don't know how we're doing for time, but I can give an example maybe of how that happens in one of the novels that I talk about in my book.
Yeah, so we have about 5 minutes on this section.
So what shall I talk? Should we go on to a different question? Or?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, just an example.
Okay, so one of the novels that I write about in the book is called Apex Hides the Hurt by Colson Whitehead. and it was published, I think, 2006, and it's a kind of satire. It's the story of this unnamed African-American protagonist, and he works in a kind of PR advertising kind of world, and his job is to name things. And he names and becomes very famous in his industry for naming this range of plasters that are designed to suit the skin tone of their wearers. So it's a kind of multicultural plaster, which he calls Apex. And anyway, I'm not going to go through the whole novel, but I think it's one of his lesser known ones, so people might not know it. So he wears one of these plasters after he stubs his toe, and this plaster obscures a much more serious wound, and in the end he ends up having to have his toe amputated. And the novel is kind of about the recovery from that, and it's basically I think a kind of satire on the way in which race is invoked in medicine for commercial ends, and it to me is speaking to a kind of real life example of that, which was Bidil, which was this drug that I'm sure some people have heard of. It was approved by the FDA in 2004 exclusively for the treatment of African Americans with congestive heart failure. And it was really supported on the basis that, oh, you know, it's kind of we need this drug, and it's going to help a certain population of people. But it had absolutely no genetic basis whatsoever. The makers admitted that race was a proxy for an unknown genetic marker that, you know, the drug might have been effective in non-African American populations, but race was a way of marketing the drug essentially. And even though it was a failure, I think it had a really big impact on the way that African Americans and Americans more generally understand race, and it kind of in a way that goes against the Human Genome Project. And, you know, there's no such thing as race. This drug appeared to be saying there is actually a genetic basis for race, and we're medicating on the basis of that. And I think to go back to the novel, I think what Whitehead is really interested in doing is exposing the kind of superficiality of the way that race is being invoked, and the problems with kind of it's a kind of a warning against the uncritical adoption of a kind of the kind of ideas about race that are being promoted in those kinds of developments. And what he does is he makes a very subtle analogy with history. So the amputation of the toe is an echo, I argue in the book, of a cure that was sometimes given to enslaved people who were diagnosed with the disease of, and I hope I'm going to get the pronunciation right, drapetomania, the disease making slaves want to run away. And it was this, you know, invention of Samuel Cartwright in the middle of the 19th century. He was this very big name in Southern medicine. So it's a completely ridiculous kind of attempt to kind of pathologize enslaved people. And I think, you know, I'm kind of, you know, I'm being very broad brush with my discussion of the novel here, but I think what Whitehead does very skillfully is to show how the kind of fictionalization of race and medicine that happened in the past is still happening today in some form or another, with the kind of with drugs like Bidil, which seem to almost make race the problem that needs to be treated, and they're kind of making race into the disease. So yeah, that's one very rough way of describing something that's a lot more complicated, but hopefully it's answered the question. So I think is it my turn now, Michelle? Great. So you're obviously working in a period about 100 years before the one that I look at, I think. But I just wondered if you could tell us a bit about your work, and then bringing it back to the theme of this this seminar series, which is anti-racism and social justice. Can you maybe speak to how your work connects to contemporary social justice movements like Black Lives Matter, and how it's maybe speaks to some of the issues which COVID has thrown up as well?
Yeah, so so like as you said, I'm very much kind of in that earlier part of history, but I do think it has a lot of my work in particular, a lot of relevance for the present, because I'm very interested in what people do with ideas of race. I think on one hand, we might think about, scientists, and a lot of my work does think about the ways in which different scientific theories are used to categorize populations. But what my work really focuses on are communities of triracial identities. So they're white, indigenous, and Black, and the ways in which ideas about what it means to be Native and what it means to be Black really circumscribes and limits the kind of identity possibilities for them. And I've been really interested in the ways in which these communities have pushed back by using a lot of these same scientific technologies, these same ideas and tropes and essentialized ways of knowing and being as a way to make identity claims for themselves. And so if we think about in the present, the ways in which both Black and Native populations have disproportionate experiences of diabetes. And so the ways in which certain circles diabetes becomes a way to signal one's indigeneity or one's Blackness, and the ways in which certain diseases show up as kind of evidence of racial taint, historically and even today. And so I think in terms of thinking about BLM, and thinking about particularly differential health outcomes. So my family's originally from Alabama, and I was really struck in the kind of first weeks of COVID, these kinds of ideas being put forth that Black Americans were immune to COVID, right? And that was so palatable in that part of the South. And I have a lot of elderly relatives, and I'm like, talking to them like, no, let's not play with the science. Not all of it's socially constructed. You should go on. And then the way in which that turned, and then we see, Black communities decimated by COVID, and the ways in which it took so long to get really narratives or discussions around the systemic issues for that. And that really first just went to kind of predispositions and the ways in which comorbidities, which make you vulnerable to COVID, became kind of signals for innateness that to me just sounded so reminiscent of stuff that we hear in the early 20th century or the 19th century about African Americans being predisposed to syphilis or tuberculosis in a particular way. And so I think, a lot of this, and that's, one of the things that I really appreciate about your work, Josie, is that it reminds us that we have to be particularly vigilant for the ways in which even well-meaning critiques or well-meaning discourses and debates about medicine and health or biology and race can really slip us into some of these more problematic configurations. And I think one of the things in terms of signaling structural inequalities, thinking about the ways in which minority populations interact with health systems, I think that's one of the beautiful things about BLM, and one of the ways in which I see its activists as really trying to kind of rejoin against some of that more damaging discourse around innateness. Because, some of it too, to play devil's advocate, I imagine some of that is born out of a desire from minority communities to want to be seen, to want to be included. And so a way in which you can collectivize sometimes is to talk through your common experience, or the ways in which you might feel disproportionately affected by a particular condition, right? But what that kind of narrative does in the wrong hands, right? It becomes like this really slippery slope. But I do think that by thinking about health inequalities in particular, BLM is doing really important work, I think, in combating that particular narrative.
I think in that sense, they're kind of doing what genetic science isn't, which is focusing on racism, right? Which is, yes, rather than the idea of race itself as being the problem, it's structural inequality and racism. That's the problem in COVID. That's what's causing the problem. And because this was going to be my next question, is how your work kind of works through that relationship between race and racism that I think is quite so often easily elided or skated over with genetics and its singular focus on the idea of race itself.
Mhm. Yeah, and it's something, that particular question is so important. It's one that I work through with my students all the time. I'm constantly getting them to think about it. I think for me, I've been really struck by Ta-Nehisi Coates, who says race is the child, not the father. And I think for me, that's been a really productive way to think about that relationship, in that, I think we could have really good debates about the kind of etymology or the genealogy of the different terms. But I do think from an ideological standpoint, the ideology of racism is not always the same ideology of race, right? And they converge and they diverge in really particular instances. And so I think that it's really important to keep our anti-racism projects and the work that they do, and think about what it means to be, and then think about the kind of purchase and the utility of race in that sense, because you can be racist without race, right? There's, we talk about that, we work through that, and I think part of the perniciousness of the time in which we live is that some of the most damaging things are being perpetuated by people who are like, I am colorblind, I can't even see that you're a Black, or or a minority in some kind of way. And so I think to get, when we focus so much on race and the work that does, we do miss the ways in which, kind of biases and prejudices are being mobilized, in particular ways that even move us past race, to a certain extent. But for me, I think, one of the things that, that is in my work, I still remain I'm attached in weird ways to race as an idea, not personally, but the people that I study intellectually, it matters for them, not just historically speaking, but in the present day, right? So one of the great things about, the University of Maryland, one of the communities that I study are the Piscataway, who have historically been marginalized because of their presumed racial past, and locked out of resources and economic opportunities, and just the ability to claim with openness who they are. Right. And there are dozens and dozens of communities like that, in the United States. And so we can say that we're post-racial, or we're beyond race, or whatever kind of configuration of it that we have, but we know that there are people that the kind of idea to put yourself, to speak of yourself in such a way, it matters. And so I'm really interested, I think, in my more current work now, is thinking about the ways in which race continues to matter, the category, the meanings that are a part of it, for so many different Americans and people, of different configurations.
Because and that's leading into my next question, which is about whether there's a kind of tension between the more popular uses of genetics and the way in which maybe sometimes certain communities are kind of buying into a biological idea of race, and maybe is there a tension between that and then the way that academics think about race and science, and how is that playing out does that play out in your work?
Yes, so there's very much tensions, particularly when we get into the more present state. Most of the communities that I study wish to be recognized and or gain some kind of federal or state recognition as Native peoples. And that is very much tethered on, to a certain degree, outside recognition of what you inwardly believe of yourself, right? That's kind of how the kind of acknowledgement process has worked. I'm kind of being broad stroke with it, but that is dependent historically on what outsiders see you as, rather than how you see yourselves. And I find that when scholars come to communities and they ask themselves various questions about what it means to be a certain identity, the lived experiences, we're not always cognizant of even what our questions do for the political projects that are very consequential for the people that we study. And so one of the things that's been at the forefront of my personal ethics in my research is trying to be sensitive. And I think, it's an imperfect project, right? But trying to be sensitive to not repeating that violence, and not kind of collapsing opportunity, and being sensitive to the political projects that are really ongoing for the communities that I study. But I do see real tension, because I think that the where we might want to think about these things as really as not real, right? They are very real for the communities, or at least that I study. And so trying to kind of carve out a space that's sensitive to that is really important.
Yeah, thank you for that answer. It's really, really interesting. So I guess maybe that also connects to what I wanted to ask next, which is the kind of future of
Josie, I'm sorry to interrupt you here, but maybe we can put a pause.
Of course, yeah.
and get and create a kind of space to have some Q&A from the audience, and maybe that question will come up from the audience, or there'll be a moment to ask it shortly. For all of our participants, if you have questions for our speakers today, feel free to post them in the Q&A. And I'm going to be sort of aggregating because of a more limited amount of time. But I'll sort of start us off with an interesting question that has come in from the chat. Because we have a number of scientists who are in the audience and are wondering whether you all have insights about how scientists might aid in this work of fighting against the appropriation of work by white supremacist discourse and what have you. Josie, this is sort of going back to some of the early comments that you made. Do you have insights for scientists about the work that they're doing, or how they're conveying that information that could be useful in promoting anti-racism?
That's a really, really good question. And obviously, I'm not in any way blaming scientists for the way that their work has been misappropriated and used. But I think maybe the question speaks to the relationship between the humanities and the sciences, and whether there can be more kind of dialogue kind of across our institutions and across our disciplines. One of the things that I'm interested in as a scholar is interdisciplinarity, and how that it's a word that gets bandied around a lot, but how that happens not just at an intellectual level, but at a practical level within the university. So for me, the kind of most immediate way of approaching this would be to have more conversations across disciplines, and to I'm very aware that I'm a humanities scholar talking about science, and all I've really got access to is scientific papers, scientific writing. Yes, I have spoken to a couple of scientists in the past, but they're in a whole other building somewhere on campus, and got a few friends who are scientists. But it's more seriously, I think the work that I'm doing it's also critical of the way that humanities scholars in many ways, in the way that we conduct our work and conduct approaches to race, and I think what I would like to see is a much a kind of focus across the humanities and the sciences on talking about race, because I don't know what the situation is in the US, but in the UK, a lot of people are afraid of talking about race, and it's avoided like the plague, because people are afraid of saying the wrong thing, or they're afraid of the decolonization debates that are going on, and they see them as radical. And I think when it comes to race, it's not when we're talking about race and genetics, it's that can't be separated from race as a whole, as it operates within the university, and all the different facets to racism and people's experiences. So I kind of think that if we can, just as a starting point, have more conversations with one another across the humanities and the sciences, and that would be a productive way of going forward. Michelle, I don't know what you think.
Yeah, I think these interdisciplinary conversations are really good. And I also find, in my own work, that scientists are often very very earnest about the limitations of their own work, but sometimes in the translation of that, like the communities or the people impacted aren't always picking that up. And so I think one of the good things about, just having just conversations with multiple stakeholders is really starting to get in, because all of us in our own disciplinary bubbles, we're used to speaking to each other. And I think thinking about the ways in which things translate outside is always really productive.
So both of you, Josie and Michelle, in your answers are touching on this question of working within the academy and the question of disciplinarity. And I think there are some questions sort of that might ask you to speak to your position within the academy, not only as scholars who are within the academy working on race, but are in a sense working on the academy's constructions, structures of race and attitudes about race, particular disciplines within the academy. And I wonder about the kinds of opportunities or the kinds of challenges that position kinds of poses. So I'm sort of aggregating a couple of different questions here, but is that something that you feel like you can?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. I think with my own work, because I do work in communities that have been particularly, for lack of a better word, victimized by academic science and its kind of interest in their lived experience. I do see myself as being, as wanting to investigate that, to illuminate that's the process that happened. But I'm also really interested in what the communities themselves are doing to combat that. So what I see as the intervention of my work is thinking about race making as something that just doesn't happen from top down, that happens from the bottom up as groups or people, individuals push back against that kind of power and expertise, and thinking about the ways in which racialized peoples have used embodied experience to really contest the kind of expertise that we've invested in the kind of traditional disciplines. So I do think the degree to which, in my work, I'm interested in what the disciplines are doing is really thinking about where power and where expertise emanates from, and the ways in which what kinds of things academics, but also people outside the academy draw on to be able to kind of claim expertise to make racial claims. And I think it's important to think about the work that traditional disciplines do, because it's one that we all exist in. But I think that what I'm really interested in is thinking about what happens outside of that as well.
That's really, it's really interesting. I think I would answer this question by speaking to my own personal experience as a founder member of the Centre for Black Humanities at Bristol, which is this interdisciplinary research centre in the Faculty of Arts that we established 4 years ago. And it kind of came together because there were a group of us who were working on, well, quite Africa, the Americas, Black Britain, the Caribbean. So the remit is quite wide, but in a way that's good, because as it turns out, the remit of the centre is incredibly wide. And to give you some context about the UK, there really aren't that many centres at all, or no history of centres which explicitly foreground Blackness, for really. And I guess there are many reasons for that. Black has a different history in the UK. In the 70s and 80s, it was a term that was used to describe and used by people of colour, people who weren't white. And I think that's now changed. We use it in the sense of people of African descent. But it does mean that I think that there's kind of I think it was quite a bold move for us to establish this centre, because I think when we did get a lot of kind of, not criticism, but when we were trying to establish it, a lot of people sort of saying, well, race isn't real, so why are you talking about Blackness? Why would you single out Blackness from other ethnicities, kind of. But I think for us it makes a lot of sense because we are situated in Bristol. And there is this, historic Black community, extremely activist community, and there's been years of trying to grapple with the legacies of slavery in the city, and creating the Centre of Black Humanities was one way in which we could try and start involving those communities within the university and bringing them in and creating a kind of space where Black people and Black staff and students could feel that they had somewhere to have certain discussions. And we've developed an MA, and we've got a bursary for Black teachers. But I think in regard to the question of scientists, what I found interesting is that I started to have kind of PhD students from the sciences coming to me and saying, I want to talk about racism, I want to talk about kind of various Black Lives Matter, and there wasn't a space for them to do that the university and people in the science faculty are, to their credit, kind of beginning these conversations now. But I think creating that centre just did a lot of work within the institution. It immediately had an institutional visibility that meant that we could support students and staff from across the disciplines. So even though we're only focused on the arts and humanities in an intellectual sense, in a much broader kind of activist sense, we are engaging with a much broader kind of constituency of academics and people more widely within Bristol. So I think I'd answer that question.
So I think there are some questions that are speaking to these very contemporary loaded terms, fact and fiction, how should we think about the relationship between fact and fiction as we sort of aim for anti-racism in our understanding of science and how science works in our cultures and society. Certainly that those two terms are very important in your book, Josie, and you're sort of thinking about contemporary novels, sort of negotiation of that balance. But as well in your work, Michelle, where you're talking about the kind of prehistory of the construction of a kind of multiracial identity that we seem to have lost, in a sense, an access to that prehistory and the kind of fact or fiction of there not being multiracial identities or not being scientific acknowledgement of multiracial identities. So I'm wondering if you all can sort of speak to this question of this loaded binary and the way that it sort of plays out in post-truth conspiracy theories and all sorts of different proliferations.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a fact denier, obviously, but scientific facts change all the time. And one of the things that I didn't manage to get onto when we were talking is epigenetics, which is this kind of recent development within the field of genetics, which kind of does overturn what was previously understood about genetics, which was that you have genes which are inherited through the generations, and apart from a few mutations here and there, they remain largely fixed and stable. And then epigenetics comes along, and scientists are now looking at how genes have these epigenetic marks which are switched on and off according to the environment in which which a body finds itself. And those marks can be well, this is still a controversial and emerging area, but they can, there's some studies that are suggesting they can be passed down through generations. So I think that's quite an interesting example of how we have to be open to the changing nature of scientific discovery. That's just the nature of science. But I think to bring fiction back into the conversation, for me, the kind of that finding of epigenetics, that the genes can carry a sort of memory, is the metaphor that's used, a memory of past environments and experiences, is really interesting. And it speaks to the way that that kind of understanding of, particularly when it comes to race, has already been imagined in fiction. So I'm thinking here of Octavia Butler's novel Kindred, which is about a woman who gets pulled back in time to the plantation of her ancestors, who happen to be white, the white people who are enslaving her enslaved ancestors, and she is in this very dynamic relationship with the past, and her body is being mutilated, and she's being whipped and tortured, and she ends up having to live in the present with missing an arm. She's actually disabled by this experience and by this encounter with history. And to me, that's a very interesting representation of how bodies come to be raced. Race is kind of created through racist environments. And I think I'm just interested in the ways in which we can think about fiction and the kinds of models that fiction that are already there for thinking about race in a slightly different way. So not as some sort of fixed biological category, but as the result of a particular circumstance or a particular belief, which happens to be fictional or imaginary. Racism is an imaginary sense of inferiority, and it's not real. So you have something that really isn't real, and that is imaginary, having real consequences in the body. So for me, there's all kinds of productive and interesting ways we can think about the relationship between fact and fiction. And I don't think we should be limited in doing that just because some people are, insistent on questioning scientific fact, because quite frankly, they're going to do that anyway, no matter what. So.
Yeah, so go ahead, Christina.
No, I was just asking if you wanted to.
Yeah, so I was just thinking of two things. Like, so I'm not in the literary studies, so just bear with me. But I often am starting to think about fiction now and the word and what it means to me, and I'm thinking about. I once described, there was a guy in 1920s in Virginia. He wanted to prove that Virginia was like race mixing to like this crazy degree. So he sat on a corner, he counted 500 people, and he said, I know of the 500 people I've counted, 250 of them are Black. And I thought about that in terms of like the thinking about the people that I'm interested in, particularly those committed to white supremacy and those committed to race, from both a scientific or even a political standpoint, the racial fictions that people tell themselves about race, and the ways in which, even as fiction, right, it does kind of lend itself to this kind of idea that it is made up and not real. But the way in which, as a fiction, people become really invested in it and tethered in it, and that it when I think about novels that I read, so Josie's reading of Colson Whitehead, I heard it. I have not felt the same about flesh-colored Band-Aids, like since, like they freak me out. But thinking about the ways in which you can hold those stories to yourself, they mean something to you. And I think particularly with race, for positive and for negative, right? It means something to people, which I think blurs the boundaries between fact and fiction. In some really, I think, productive ways, but also, of course, in some really problematic ways.
I wanted to sort of draw a kind of frame around the appeal to novels in particular, like that this kind of fact versus fiction often sort of lends itself to, has lent itself and does in Josie's book, to a kind of focus on novels. And I wonder if, and Michelle too, like, fiction became, in part a conversation about novels. If there's some thought about novels having a specific role to play in the kind of work that you're talking about versus other kinds of forms that also tell stories, or other kinds of forms that also are narrative. And we might take that in a literary direction and think about poetry or plays, but we might think as well about films or television programs or what have you. So I'm wondering if there is some sense for you all that novels are a kind of go-to place. Is your sense that they play some sort of special role in the cultural imaginary, or that their scale is important or meaningful for why they might be a productive site for doing the kind of work of historicizing science that you're both sort of advocating for? Does that make sense?
Yeah, difficult question, Christina.
Yeah, it's really good. Sitting back trying
it's a really good question, because obviously there are plenty of films, both popular and not, that deal with genetics, and I can think of poetry, poets, and plays. I think for better or worse, the novel has a particular hold in the popular imagination. And I'm thinking of one of the novels I look at in the book is Roots by Alex Haley, and it was just this huge phenomenon. It was read by so many people, and it was made into a TV show. But I think those kind of really influential narratives often tend to come out of literature. Another novel I look at is White Teeth, and that was, another really big popular kind of marketed. There's lots of work on the way that novel was marketed at the turn of the millennium, and it was read. It was really bestseller. So I wonder. I guess my thinking is that the novel as a form potentially has more access to, because of its positioning, and more purchase in the kind of public realm, and then it's kind of better positioned to contribute to conversations that go on. So with Roots, so many, I talk about in the first chapter of my book how so many science writers who are writing on human origins in Africa and African ancestries talk about roots very explicitly, so or implicitly, but I think not, talking about the kind of broad constituents of people who are consuming literature. Most kind of people, maybe scientists, maybe this is a massive generalization, I don't know where I'm going with this, but a lot of people just read novels. And I think thinking about where kind of literature directly kind of comes into and influences science, I think that's where I think the novel is probably where that happens. That's probably an inadequate answer to that question, but it's the best I've got right now.
Yeah, I just agree. I agree with Josie. I think that the novel, with its scale, with its portability, I think that it is able to speak. And I also think in novels, you get a fleshing out, I think, sometimes of characters, which of course can happen in short stories and other mediums as well. But I think the textualness of that can travel in a particular way that I think in terms of trying to think about how people are working through race becomes really a productive space to work from.
Well, I want to thank both Josie and Michelle for this extremely interesting and wide-ranging conversation. I want to thank all of the people who have contributed questions, not all of which I managed to get to in my attempt to aggregate. So I apologize for that. But thank you so much. I want to hand things over in closing to Tita, in case you want to say something about possible future availability of the video and so forth. That was also a question someone posed.
Thank you so much. I just very quickly, to Josie and Michelle for your brilliance and your work creating a deeply ethical intellectual community. It's an honor to be with you, to be in this presence virtually. And my thanks to Karen and Liam and Danielle, as always, and to my colleague, Christina. Thank you very much. This is recorded, and after post-production closed captioning, we're making everything accessible. It will be available on our YouTube channel. So thank you very much. And please join me in thanking our speakers here and on Twitter and in all the ways that we can support their really important work. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Tita. Thank you, Christina.
Thank you.